On April 17th, Iran's foreign minister announced that the Strait of Hormuz was completely open to all commercial vessels. Oil prices dropped 9%. The Dow surged to a record. Markets celebrated what looked like the first real sign of progress since the ceasefire began. Less than 24 hours later, Iran reversed the decision entirely. The IRGC declared the strait had returned to strict military control. Gunboats opened fire on a tanker near Oman. An Indian supertanker carrying 2 million barrels of Iraqi crude was forced back out of the waterway. Ships received radio messages that the strait was closed again and no vessels were permitted to pass. Iran's supreme leader wrote on Telegram that the Navy was ready to inflict new bitter defeats on enemies. The cycle of opening and closing, of hope and reversal, is not a malfunction. It is the negotiation itself, playing out in the water. The ceasefire between the United States and Iran expires on April 22nd. When it was announced on April 8th, both sides treated it as a doorway to something permanent. Trump called it a big day for world peace. Iran's Supreme National Security Council said nearly all war objectives had been achieved. Pakistan's prime minister, who brokered the deal, invited both delegations to Islamabad the following week. Markets surged. Oil dropped 16% in a single day. For roughly 48 hours, the world believed the war was winding down. It wasn't. Vice President J.D. Vance arrived in Islamabad on April 11th with Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner. Iran sent Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi and Parliament Speaker Mohammad Bagher Ghalibaf. Pakistan's Army Chief, Field Marshal Asim Munir, was in the room. What followed was the highest-level face-to-face meeting between American and Iranian officials since the 1979 revolution. The talks lasted 21 hours. They covered three fundamental issues: Iran's nuclear program, control of the Strait of Hormuz, and the war in Lebanon. On every issue, the two sides moved toward each other. On none of them did they close the gap. On the nuclear question, the United States proposed a 20-year suspension of uranium enrichment. Iran countered with 3 to 5 years. The U.S. also demanded that Iran hand over more than 400 kilograms of highly enriched uranium, enough for roughly 11 nuclear weapons, according to the International Atomic Energy Agency. Iran's enriched uranium is reportedly still buried underground from U.S. bombing during the war, and Tehran offered a monitored process of downblending, where the material would be diluted into less potent forms under international supervision, but remain on Iranian soil. Trump has been unequivocal on this point. He told Fox News the meeting was good, except for one issue: they want to have nuclear weapons, and it's not going to happen. Iran frames the question differently. Tehran says enrichment is a sovereign right, that its program is for civilian purposes, and that the United States already walked away from one nuclear deal in 2018. An analyst at the Middle East Policy Council said the Iranians can't look like they've capitulated because the credibility of the regime at home and overseas is at stake. On Hormuz, the divide is even starker. The United States considers a fully reopened strait with no tolls and no Iranian control to be a non-negotiable red line. Vance said as much publicly after leaving Islamabad. Iran sees the strait as sovereign territory, shared only with Oman, and insists on the right to manage transit and collect fees. During the war, Iran charged an estimated $2 million per ship for passage, payable in yuan. That toll system became both a revenue source and a symbol of leverage. Trump floated the idea of joint U.S.-Iranian administration of the waterway. Tehran rejected it outright. Iran's semi-official Fars News quoted an official saying, "It seems that the United States is seeking to achieve through negotiations what it did not achieve during the 40-day war." The two sides are locked in a mirror image. Iran says the strait will not reopen freely until the U.S. lifts its blockade. The U.S. says the blockade will not end until Iran accepts a deal. Each side is using its control over traffic as leverage, and neither is willing to go first. On Lebanon, the two sides could not even agree on whether it was part of the ceasefire. Pakistan's prime minister announced that the deal covered all fronts, including Lebanon. Netanyahu immediately rejected that, and Trump backed him. Hours after Hezbollah said it would halt attacks under the ceasefire terms, Israel launched what it called its strongest wave of strikes on Lebanon since the start of the war, killing at least 357 people in a single day. Lebanon's government called it a massacre. Iran responded by pausing Hormuz traffic again. The entire ceasefire nearly collapsed in its first 48 hours over a question that the two sides answered differently in public. Lebanon was not a secondary issue. It was central to Iran's willingness to negotiate at all. Tehran made clear that any permanent agreement had to include a halt to Israeli operations against Hezbollah. Without that, Iran's negotiators said they had no mandate to make concessions on anything else. If you're finding this analysis useful and you want to keep seeing breakdowns that go beyond the headlines, consider subscribing. I cover angles on this conflict that most channels don't touch. Anyway, let's continue. Since Islamabad, 3 developments have changed the landscape in ways that make the deadline more dangerous than it was a week ago. First, the United States imposed a full military blockade on Iranian ports on April 13th, less than 5 days after the ceasefire began. Every vessel entering or departing Iranian coastal areas is now subject to interception, diversion, and capture. CENTCOM reports that 21 ships have been turned back. Approximately 230 loaded oil tankers remain stuck inside the Gulf, unable to move. Iran is losing an estimated $435 million per day in trade. Under international law, a blockade is an act of war. The last comparable U.S. naval operation was Kennedy's quarantine of Cuba in 1962. The United States is simultaneously maintaining a ceasefire and imposing an economic chokehold that, from Tehran's perspective, is indistinguishable from warfare. Second, Trump brokered a 10-day ceasefire between Israel and Lebanon on April 16th. This was potentially the most significant development since Islamabad, because Lebanon had been the issue that nearly collapsed everything. Iran immediately responded by announcing it would reopen the Strait of Hormuz for the first time since the war began. For a few hours, the puzzle appeared to be assembling itself. Pakistan's foreign minister said the Lebanon ceasefire cleared one major roadblock, and that the Islamabad talks had ended very close to an agreement. Markets rallied. Oil fell. The logic was straightforward. If Lebanon was resolved, Iran could negotiate on Hormuz and nuclear issues without feeling like it was abandoning its allies. Third, that progress collapsed within hours. Trump declared that the U.S. blockade would remain in full force regardless of what Iran did, until a comprehensive deal was reached, including on the nuclear question. Iran's response was immediate and severe. The armed forces reversed the Hormuz opening. The IRGC began turning ships around at gunpoint. Gunboats opened fire near Oman. The head of Iran's Parliament National Security Committee posted on social media, "We warned you, you did not listen. Now enjoy the return of the Strait of Hormuz to its previous state." And IRGC-affiliated Tasnim news agency reported that Iran has not agreed for now to a new round of negotiations with the United States. Tehran reportedly conveyed that decision through a Pakistani intermediary. Iran's foreign ministry also denied reports that it had agreed to transfer its enriched uranium abroad, a claim Trump had made publicly. So where does this leave things as the ceasefire clock runs down? The signals from every direction are contradictory. Regional officials told the Associated Press that both sides have given an in-principle agreement to extend the ceasefire for at least another 2 weeks. Pakistan's foreign minister said mediators remain optimistic. Trump said the war is very close to over. But Mohsen Rezaieh, a former IRGC commander and now a military advisor to Supreme Leader Mojtaba Khamenei, said publicly that he does not support extending the ceasefire. Iran's Parliament National Security Committee chairman said the ceasefire will not be extended without Iranian control of Hormuz. And Trump himself said he may not extend the ceasefire if negotiations do not produce an agreement by the deadline. Both sides are simultaneously signaling willingness to extend the truce and threatening to let it expire. The International Crisis Group's Iran director described the most likely near-term scenario as not immediate all-out war, but a volatile period of pressure, signaling, and last-minute attempts to prevent a wider conflagration. That assessment captures the most probable outcome. Neither side currently wants to resume full-scale hostilities. Iran needs time to rebuild. Its missile cities are still partially buried, its air defenses are degraded, and its economy is under blockade. The United States has its own reasons for restraint. The war is broadly unpopular domestically, gas prices are climbing, and Trump administration officials have privately told CNN they are not keen to resume bombing. But neither side can afford to be seen as the one who blinked. If the ceasefire is extended, it will likely be extended not because both sides want peace, but because both sides need more time to improve their position before the next confrontation. The gap between the two sides' positions is not a negotiating gap. It is a structural incompatibility. The United States wants Iran to surrender its nuclear program, give up control of Hormuz, and stop funding armed groups across the region. In exchange, the U.S. is offering the lifting of sanctions and normalization. Iran wants security guarantees that it will never be bombed again, war reparations, its frozen assets returned, sovereignty over Hormuz recognized, and the right to maintain a civilian nuclear program. These are not positions that split the difference. The U.S. is asking Iran to become a fundamentally different country. Iran is asking the United States to accept the country it already is. The Islamabad talks showed that movement is possible. The U.S. offered 20 years on enrichment, and Iran countered with 5. Those numbers can, in theory, converge. But the deeper question, whether Iran keeps any enrichment capability at all, is the one that broke the talks. And it is the one that has broken every U.S.-Iran negotiation for the past 20 years. Meanwhile, the war continues in ways the ceasefire was supposed to prevent. Iran is excavating its underground missile cities, clearing rubble from tunnel entrances so ballistic missile launchers can emerge again. Satellite imagery shows front-end loaders scooping debris from entrances to the massive underground complexes where Iran stores and manufactures ballistic missiles. U.S. intelligence estimates that roughly half of Iran's missile launchers survived 6 weeks of bombing, many of them buried but intact. U.S. intelligence also says China is preparing to deliver air defense systems to Iran within weeks. Israel is still conducting strikes in southern Lebanon despite the new truce, with the Lebanese army reporting violations within hours of the ceasefire taking effect. The U.S. blockade is strangling Iran's economy in real time. Iran's internet blackout, now in its 50th day, has cut off the country's population from the outside world, in what the monitoring group NetBlocks called a shutdown unprecedented for a connected society. The IRGC's intelligence unit announced the arrest of 127 people across 3 provinces on security-related charges. More than 3,000 people have been killed in Iran. More than 2,000 have been killed in Lebanon. 13 American service members are dead. The cost of the war to the U.S. military has exceeded $18 billion, with the Pentagon requesting $200 billion more. None of this pauses because a ceasefire exists on paper. The outcome depends on a calculation neither side can make with certainty. Iran is betting that the economic pain of high oil prices, rising gas costs, and a fractured global supply chain will eventually force Washington to soften its demands. The United States is betting that the blockade and sustained military pressure will eventually force Tehran to accept terms it has already rejected at the negotiating table. Both bets assume the other side will break first. The ceasefire is the period during which both sides are testing that assumption. If neither breaks, and the deadline arrives without a deal or an extension, the question is not whether the war resumes. The question is who resumes it and what they are willing to destroy to prove they were right not to blink. The ceasefire was never the end of the war. It was the intermission, and the lights are flickering.